Hi, it's Vicky from So Fabulous Fabrics. Let's take a look at the project which went into January's Fabulous Quilters Club subscription box. So for this month we were making the Wonky House bucket bag, and here is the finished bag. The main part of this tutorial is actually to learn how to foundation paper piece. So you can see that the houses, the leaves and the trees have all been foundation paper pieced. So that is the main part of the project. But as an added bonus, I've also given instructions on how to make the bucket bag and how to quilt it. So let's get to the tutorial. Let's take a look at the foundation paper piece patterns you're going to need to be able to do this project. Now, you will need to print them out when you purchase the PDF. This set here, which is the full set, I have printed on Carol Doak's foundation paper. Now, this is a very thin paper which goes through your printer really well, so that's no problem at all. And the reason I use this is when we get to the stage of taking the paper from the back of the fabric, it's quite easy to tear away. You don't have to use this, you can just use normal printer paper, which I also do use. I also use a pair of tweezers to take it from the back of the fabric because I find that a little bit easier. But you can stitch through this very easily with just your ordinary sewing machine. So that is another option. The pattern pieces that you're going to need, you've got 3 houses. So we've got Wonky House number 1, number 2, which comes in 2 pieces, and number 3, and then you have got you'll need to print 2 sets of the leaves and 2 sets of the Wonky tree. So that's all the pattern pieces that you're going to need to be able to make your foundation paper piece project. I have chosen 8 different fabrics for my project today, and they are all 100% cotton. And I've got a mix of plains and some prints. Let's take a look at the tools and equipment you will need for your foundation paper piecing. So I've got a rotary cutter for cutting the fabrics. I've also got a second rotary cutter. Now this one has got an old used blade in it, which still will cut, but it's useful to be able to cut the fabric and paper together, because when you do foundation paper piecing, you're going to need to cut through paper to do the trimming. So if you've got a second rotary cutter, that's great that you can put an old blade in. If you haven't, then if you've got a pair of scissors that you know will cut through fabric and paper and that they're okay, then I would put those aside and use those. Next, I've got a seam roller. This is used for just pressing the seams. This is really useful to have, or something very similar to this. You have to do a lot of pressing with foundation paper piecing. And if you're like me, I'd have to get up and do the ironing all the time, which is great exercise, but it could wear you out quite quickly. So this is a useful gadget to have for pressing your seams. If you don't have something like that, a seam roller, but you do have a point turner, then you could use the flat edge of something like that as well. Next, we've got some tweezers. You do have lots of very small pieces of paper which are stuck with the stitching on the back of your work that you would need to pull out. So most of it you can get out with just using your fingers and your nails. But you will have some smaller pieces, so tweezers are a good idea. I've got a sew-line glue stick, which I use to anchor my first bit of fabric on my FPP pattern. An unpicker is always good. We don't really like having to use them, but obviously there are times when we do. So that's my unpicker. Pair of fabric scissors. I have a piece of template plastic which I use to help press open the pieces for my FPP. If you've got a thin piece of card like a postcard, something like that, that would also do, but that's a useful thing to have. I've got some quilting clips and some pins because I like to use both. Quilter's ruler, sewing thread. Now I use Gutermann colour 38. This is an all-purpose polyester thread for my piecing. The reason I use this colour is because it just blends in with most colours of fabric, so that's the one that I use the most, and that's 1,000 meters on that one. Also, along with everything else, you will need your iron and either ironing board, or as I have got here, I've got a wool pressing mat. So those are all the pieces of equipment you're going to need. So let's move on and have a look at the patterns. For this tutorial, we will be stitching Wonky House 1 and a set of the leaves. You could do 3 of the Wonky House 1 if you wanted to. This is probably the simplest out of the 3 houses. So as I say, you could do 3 all of the same. It really doesn't matter. The first thing to do with your FPP pattern is to cut out all the individual pieces. I always leave a bit of a border around the outside, and then it's easier to be able to pop the pieces of fabric on. So I'm going to do that first of all, and then I will explain how the pattern works within each of the blocks. Let's take a closer look at the pieces that we have just cut out. So you will notice that there is a solid line around the coloured part of the shape, and then a small dotted line around that. Now the width between these 2 pieces is your seam allowance, which is 1/4 inch. So the solid line will be the stitching line, and the dotted line is the cutting line. Each of the pieces has got a letter and a number, and it's a bit like paint by numbers, so you're going to be following in order of the number for each piece as to where you're going to put the next piece of fabric. So each of them are separate, so you've got A, B, C, and going on obviously. The last piece I've got in this set, which is G1, is just one piece on its own, which will have one piece of fabric stuck over the top, and then we will trim it to size using the dotted line as the cutting line. So we'll go back and find section A, and this is the one we are going to start with. So I have got piece A in front of me, and the first piece we're going to cover is A1. Now I'm using the yellowy sort of ochre type colour, and the piece that I've cut out needs to be able to cover the 1/4 inch seam allowance that's at the bottom, and then 1/4 inch all the way around. So if I just flip the piece over and just put it up to any sort of light source, which I hope you're able to see, I'll just get that a bit more straight, then I can see that that piece of fabric covers all of that first piece A1. So on the reverse side of your paper, I'm going to put a little bit of glue on there. This is just to anchor that first piece down so as it doesn't move, and I shall lay that over the top, and I'm just going to hold it up and double check to make sure that it is covered, which it is. I then like to flip mine back over, and using my piece of plastic, which I didn't have ready, I like to pop that just below that solid line that goes between A1 and A2, and I'm going to fold the paper back. Now the reason for doing it just off the line is because the plastic obviously has a tiny bit of thickness to it. It's probably about 1/2 millimetre, and it would take up some of that area of the paper. So I shall just flip that back and press it. Just remove that out of the way, and then I'm just going to trim a 1/4 inch seam allowance for this first piece. So we'll just do that very quickly. Okay, and then we'll pop it back so as it is the wrong side upwards. Your next piece of fabric will need to go wrong side down, so you're going to have your two wrong sides pieces together. So flipping it back over, we're now going to be covering A2, and again, like A1, we need a piece of fabric that is going to cover the seam allowance and have a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around. So let's just see if that's going to cover. Yep, that's fine. So I will, wrong way around. So that piece will go onto there, and then flipping it back to the right way, we're going to stitch along this dark line that separates A1 and A2. I'm going to use a 1.5 stitch length. The reason for using such a small stitch length is that when we've completed the whole of this piece, we will be tearing the paper away from the fabric, and using a very small stitch length enables us to do that very easily. I'm also going to start slightly away from this line, either side of the line, start and finish, and I'm going to backstitch as well, which will just anchor it all together. So I will go to the machine now and stitch that on, and then we'll come back and have a look. There is the first piece of fabric stitched on. I hope you can just about see the stitching line that's on the front of the FPP piece. So once we flip it over, we're now going to press this top piece of fabric over, which should then cover the shape that is underneath. So just finger press it, and then if you've got a seam roller, then just press that as well. Okay, so next we're going to be doing A3. So again, I like to cut a seam allowance first of all. So placing my plastic just to the left of that line, folding this back. If you've got where your stitches have come over into that line, just push the fabric back down, that's absolutely fine. And just make sure that that is against the plastic. There we go. And again, I'm going to cut a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So this next piece is quite a large piece for the blue. Just turn it around the other way. So I'm going to have a look at my fabric with the clouds on and have a look and see if I can find a cloud that I could use that would perhaps sit in the middle of that actual piece. So I think that one could be one that I could use. So again, I'm going to need to cut it so as it has got at least a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way round. So sometimes this can be quite hard to judge. You will find your way of being able to achieve that. So it's a bit like fussy cutting. So I'm going to place it on the top and get it into the centre the best I can. I'm just going to check it in the light. That might be okay. And what I could do, because I've got this extra piece of paper either side of the seam allowance, what I could do is just cut around this using my rotary cutter and then finish it off with my scissors. So we'll just move that around. And then I'm just going to finish, just cut that piece off like that. Then hopefully that should be big enough to fit in. So turning your piece of work back over to where your fabrics are, we're now going to lay this piece of fabric down against these to cover A3. So again, it'd be right sides together. Now what you do need to determine, especially with this piece, is which way the cloud is going to go. So when it is on, it's going to be going that way. So we need to pop it down so that the cloud's face is facing upwards. And then when we flip it over, it will cover this piece and the cloud will hopefully be in the middle. You again can check this in your light and see if that is going to work. Okay, so I will now go to the sewing machine and stitch that on. Again, looking at the stitching line, you can see that I have stitched 1 or 2 stitches either side of the printed line. So flipping it back over, we're now going to pull this piece across and using my seam roller, we will just press that. Now just be a bit careful when you are pressing these seams that you don't sort of pull the fabric too much and skew it slightly, because you've only got stitching in the middle part. Sometimes if you pull these pieces that aren't stitched down sort of over a bit, you might find that the paper that's underneath won't be covered by the fabric, because what you're looking for, if we flip it back, is for your center pieces to be covered and your seam allowance, because it's the seam allowance that's going to be stitched together. So hopefully you can see that the seam allowance is covered by the fabric. Okay, so we're now ready to move on to A4. So again, using my piece of plastic, just place that just near to that solid line. Again, pull it over, and because I've stitched into this section A4, it obviously has got the stitching here which is bringing the fabric up, but you can just gently pull that away and it will pull the stitching away from the paper, but still keeping it secure. So I'll just finger press that, and again I'm going to trim to a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then we're going to look for another piece of the bluey turquoise fabric to cover A4. We could do another fussy cut cloud if you like, but the fabric that I'm using has such a lot of big gaps in it and not that many clouds. It could be quite wasteful to do it that way. So I'm probably going to look at this piece here to cover this piece. So if I just lay that on, it's plenty big enough. So I'm going to cut just down here. And then this is the piece of fabric you're going to attach it to. So I shall just pop that against there. And again, if you're using that angle, you can just check to make sure that the paper underneath is going to be covered when you flip your fabric back. So turning that over, we're now going to stitch along this line here that joins A1 and A2 to A4. There we have all 4 pieces of fabric stitched on to the paper, which is section A. I'm now going to trim this paper from the fabric so as you can just see the shape a little bit better. So I'm going to use my rotary cutter that's got the old blade in it, and just using the quilting ruler I will just trim that up. Now just where this corner is, you can see there's a different shape. I would cut around that shape as it is, because it will help when you're fitting the pieces of FPP together to form the block. Those will help you to put the pieces together correctly. So I'm going to be cutting through the paper and the fabric together on the dotted line. each section of the block that you're working on is a mirror of the finished block. So when we flip this over to the side with the fabrics, when you go to stitch all your pieces together, this will be the correct way round. So we've done A, so we've got a little cloud and the rest of the sky, and then we've got a chimney in the middle. I've trimmed all of the pieces of paper off, so this is now at the correct size for when we're going to stitch other pieces onto it. So we're now going to take the paper off the back, so as you can see it's without the paper. So just gently pull the paper away from the stitching. It should come away quite easily. If anything gets caught, either give it a gentle tug or leave it until you've got to the end, and then if there are any little bits of paper stuck, you can just use your tweezers to get them out. So we'll just take that off as much as we can. Oh, that came off quite easily. So that's your first piece finished. We are now moving on to section B, which is the roof. So we have got a bit of the sky and a window and then the roof. So the fabrics I'm using are going to be this teal coloured spotty one for the window frame. This beautiful terracotta is going to be for the actual roof, and then this pale bluey colour will be the window, which is B1, and then the bluey cloud one that we've used for section A will be for B9. So flipping your template over, we're going to be covering B1 with the pale blue first of all. So again, we will have a look at the size of the piece and just cut a piece of fabric that will cover that. Now B1 is not on an edge, but we will still need to have a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around, because we have got the outside of the window, the frame part, to stitch onto B1. So that piece should cover. I'll turn it back over the right way. So we'll try that again. So again, you can just hold it up to the light and see if it is covering with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, which that piece is. So again, it's a plain piece of fabric, but you will need to have your wrong side down onto your paper template. So I'm going to just put a little bit of glue in the middle there and just stick that over the top, covering the seam allowance at the bottom. So that's that piece on. And then we're going to be looking for B2, which is going to be in this teal coloured piece of fabric with the spots on. So we'll need a piece that will cover B2 and have a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around. So I think that piece should do it. So I'm just going to cut that piece off. In fact, that may possibly fit the other way. Yes, so there's plenty either side of these two lines that are on the edge of B2 to cover that. So we will look at that of covering it with the 1/4 inch seam allowance. So that should be enough. And then using the piece of plastic what we're going to do first of all is we're going to just press this piece back, so placing your straight edge of your plastic just on the left hand side of that line. We're just going to pull that piece over and just give it a press, and then as we did on A, we will trim the fabric away, leaving a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So we'll just take that bit away, and then we're going to place this piece that we've already measured against there, fold it back open, and we're going to stitch along this line that joins B1 to B2. There is B2 stitched on, so we're now going to stitch B3, which is on the opposite side of B1. So I'm going to go ahead and do B3, B4 and B5, and then we'll come back and we'll look at doing B6 and B7. So there we have the window and 3 parts of the frame and part of the roof stitched on. So we're now going to do B6 and B7. So using some more of the teal with the spots on, we're going to do B6. So I will just cut a strip of that one, and then again allowing for the 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around. Sometimes it is best to cut a piece of fabric much bigger than what you think you need to make sure that you've got it covered. It might seem a little bit wasteful, but to be honest with you, I've got a whole pile of scraps to the right hand side of me that I've been using for other pieces of my FPP. So you do find that you do end up using a lot of your smaller pieces, so I wouldn't worry too much about it. Okay, so let's pop that one. Actually, what we're going to do first of all is we're just going to fold this piece back. So B6 we're against, and just fold that against the plastic, and then I'm going to trim my 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then we're ready to place this piece of fabric. So we'll just pop that on there, and I can see with the light where the piece is, so we'll just flip that over so I've got that around the right way, and I'm going to stitch along this line here that's between B1 and B6, and then using some of the terracotta I'm going to stitch B7 onto B6. There we have the window frame with the window and some of the roof already stitched on. So just flipping it back the other way, we've now got B8 and B10 that we're going to be doing. So the fabric that I'm using for the roof is this directional print. Now, if you want to, you could fussy cut your pieces like we did with the clouds. If you want to, you can cut your pieces out so as they sit all the same way around. I have done a house already. This is another one of the Wonky house patterns, and I have not worried about which way the fabric actually goes for the house. So if you want to do it like that, then just go ahead and cut your pieces. It's not so wasteful doing it that way. I quite like it where it's a bit more higgledy-piggledy, because it actually gives it a bit more dimension and doesn't make it look quite so even. But it's entirely up to you how you want to do it. The pieces for the roof are pretty straightforward. So as long as you get the angle right for when you're stitching, then it would be fine just to cut it in the one direction. Okay, so I am not going to do that. I'm just going to check to see if I've got any other pieces already that would be large enough, but unfortunately I haven't. So first of all then, we're going to take we're going to do 8, and I'm just looking, oh there it is, just looking for my piece of plastic. So we'll just fold that back, and I'm just going to trim the excess off, so leaving a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then this piece here is actually quite a large piece, so I am going to just have a look at the fabric that I have, and it's also going to be oh, it's going to be sewn onto there, isn't it? So this piece should be okay. So I'm going to allow this extra piece as well as the seam allowance, and I'm going to cut it, just find my scissors. I'm going to cut a square or an oblong about there, and just covering the seam allowance there. Okay, so we've trimmed the edge. Not quite sure what's happened there. Let's just find my plastic again. Just put that back on there. I know why. Because the stitching's here, I haven't pulled it away from the fabric to get onto that solid line. So I'm just going to ease that off the stitching. Hopefully that should be it. We just double check. Yeah, I think so. You could also just pick it up, keeping the plastic in place, and just ease the fabric back from the stitching so as you can get it as flat as you can. And hopefully that will then be in the right place. It's more really for just the trimming. It's not anything to do with the stitching. But obviously we want to try and make it as accurate as we can. So a little bit more trimmed off. So we are going to be stitching this larger piece of fabric onto this piece just here to cover the 8. Okay, so right sides together, and we should find that if we were just to flip that over, then that will be covered. So I'm going to stitch that one on, and we'll come back and have a look. There we go. We can see that that piece of fabric fully covers B8. So we're now going to do B9. So I'm just going to find my plastic again and just fold that back. And cut off the excess fabric, leaving a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Okay, so B9 is going to be the clouds on the sky. So we need to just see if have I got a cloud that would fit on this piece. This is probably not quite big enough, B9. So I'm just going to use just a piece of the blue. I'll just check my scraps and see if I've got anything that is big enough, but I don't think I have. Nope. So I could use that cloud, part of that cloud, because that would be a waste otherwise, just to cut in the middle. So the way it's going to go is it's going to fit across there and then flip over. So which part? I think it's only going to end up being a small edge of the cloud to make sure that we've got the seam allowances in. Okay, so that's fine. So that would be, if we just folded that over, so we're going to cut about there. Sorry, I think I just went off camera then. So we'll pop that piece on there, and then we will stitch along that line that joins B9 to B8. We've now got the final piece for the roof ready to stitch on. There we go, that's all the pieces for the roof stitched on. So we're now ready for trimming. So we'll just turn it back over. And using my rotary cutter that has got the old blade in it and my quilting ruler, we'll just trim all the excess paper off. And there we have the roof part of our Wonky house finished. So now we've completed the roof with the little window in it, and we've also got part of the sky. So those two pieces will be stitched together, and then on this left hand corner you're going to want to stitch piece C1. So I have got my template, and if you lay your template right side down against your fabric, then you can cut out the shape, as I have done here, that will fit over this part of the template, including the seam allowances, and I've included the little bit extra that we've cut around the template. So I'm going to glue this onto here, just so as it's a bit more steady as I'm cutting it out. So I'll just get my glue pen. You don't need much, it's just really just to anchor it while you're trimming. We'll place that on the top, and then using my rotary cutter that's got the old blade in it, just flip that over, and we'll just trim the edges off. So there we have the piece trimmed, and you can see that I have trimmed around the corners according to the pattern as well, because this will just make it a bit easier when you're piecing the pieces together to fit it onto the right area. So that piece is done. So that will go, I know I haven't sewn it with the seam allowances, but that will go along that edge, that left hand edge there. So this piece will fit down here, and this piece will butt up to that corner up there. So that's the roof and the sky finished. We're now moving on to the windows. So I've got window D. So for this I'm going to need the pale blue for D1, which is the centre of the window. The patterned sort of terracotta-y colour is for the outside of the window, so the frame, and then the house is going to be in the teal colour with the little spots on it, so that's going to be these 4 pieces here. So starting with D1, I will cut a piece. Just pop it on the top there just so as I can see the sort of size, and still allowing for your 1/4 inch seam allowance as well. So it's not a massive piece, but we do need to allow for that seam allowance as well. So hopefully that will be enough. Just going to lay that on the top there, and I can just about see that, yes, I can see the seam allowances through there, and it is covering it. So turning that over, pop some glue in the middle just to anchor that first piece down. So that's D1. We're now going to do D2. So using the little bit of plastic, just going to put that as close to the edge between D1 and D2, not right on the black line, but just a tiny little bit away. And we're just going to fold that over, and then I'm going to trim 1/4 inch seam allowance, and the fabric that's going to be used for that is this one here. So it's not a huge piece width-wise, but again we're going to need to have a 1/4 inch either side, and on leading from D2 to D6 as well. So it's a skinny piece but wide. That didn't make much sense actually. We'll have a look and see. So I think the width of this will be fine. So I'm going to cut, I think that should be plenty. So I can see through the paper where the lines are, that it will cover. Another little tip that you can do to make sure that you have got it completely covered is if you fold it back open like that and keeping your 2 pieces of fabric together, flip them over, then this is a bit fiddly for this piece because it's quite small, but just pull your pattern piece over to the line that you're going to be stitching on. So in this case, it'll be this black line here that is joining D2 onto D1. And then you can see, just by looking at the fabric underneath, that you've got plenty of fabric to cover that piece that you're going to be doing next. So I'll just undo that, and then we're going to go over to the sewing machine and we're going to stitch just down here. Now if you can, try not to stitch on either side of these pieces. It just makes it a little bit easier for when you're attaching D4 and D5, that you haven't got a lot of stitching within that area. When you're stitching off the sides of the pattern into the seam allowance, then that is absolutely fine. But if you can, it doesn't matter if you can't, because you can pull the fabric away from the paper very carefully. But if you can, reverse stitch up to that line and then stitch down to the line and then reverse stitch. Okay, so we'll go and get that one done. So we have piece D2 stitched onto D1, and I have just straightened it out and used my seam press just to press it. Then coming back over, and we're now looking for D3, which is on the opposite side. So turning that around, pop your template or piece of card against that line that leads from D1 to D3, or just underneath it. Pull that over, just flatten that down. Cut a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then we want a piece of the terracotta again. So I've got mine here, just going to cut a strip of that. And again, we can just check to see if we've got enough. So flip that over, hold your pieces of fabric, flip the paper over to where the line is that you're going to be stitching, and we can see straight away, hopefully you can see, that the fabric underneath is going to be enough to cover that. So I'm going to go and stitch D3, then I'm also going to do D4 and D5. Well, I'll do D4 first and we'll come back and look at that one before moving on to D5. I've stitched on D4 and I've stitched from the edge on this side to the edge on that side, and then I've done some back stitches just so as I haven't gone into D7 and D6. So I'm just going to press that piece open. And then we will be doing D5. So that is ready to be stitched on, and then that will complete the frame around the window. There we have D6 and D7 stitched on, which are either side of the window. So we are now going to move on to D8. So this piece goes from one edge to the other edge where your seam allowances are. So when you stitch this piece on, you can stitch into your seam allowance. Just press that open, and as you can see, I have got plenty either side of where we have placed the previous pieces to allow for the 1/4 inch seam allowance that you're going to need for D8. So that is very important, because that's shown that we have covered all of the pieces with that allowance as well. So sometimes it does seem a bit wasteful, that you're cutting fabric much bigger than the piece that you actually need, but you do need to make sure that those seam allowances on the edges are covered. Otherwise you'll have gaps in your little piece that you're constructing. Okay, so we're going to do D8, which is the teal blue, and this is my piece here. So we'll pop that on, making sure that the seam allowance that you've got is inside that piece, so the piece behind is covering it. This is a little bit tight, this one, so I am going to flip it open because I want to see if it's actually going to cover it, because I'm not actually sure it's going to. And we'll pop that there. We'll press down on there on that solid line. And it is a little bit tight. I don't know whether you can see, just in this corner, there's the edge of the fabric, and that's the corner that we need to cover, and this side is even tighter. But I'm going to give it a go. I can always unstitch it, which I know is a seamstress's nightmare really in some ways, but I'm going to give it a go, and then we can see if it has actually covered it. Before I went over to the sewing machine, I just popped a pin in the front just to keep the two fabrics together so as they didn't move. So we'll take that out, and here is the truth. Let's flip that over, and we'll just pull that piece over, flatten it out a bit with your fingers, give it a bit of a press, and then we'll flip it back over, and hopefully, oh, look at that, we've covered just about, whether you can see, there's the point for the seam allowance, and there's the edge of the fabric, so everything else is covered. So we're going to now move on to D9. So I will stitch D9, and then we'll come back and have a look at the piece ready for trimming. There's the second window completed. So I'm now going to trim all of the bits of excess paper and fabric. I'm just going to trim the threads off from the front as well. I have been trimming them as I've been going along. There was a few left. So that is the second window. Let's have a recap on what we have already stitched. So we've got the sky plus the chimney, we've got the roof, and we've got the corner piece of sky. So we've got window number 1, then we've got window number 2 and window number 3, and now we are going to come along and do the door. For the door, you're going to need the terracotta fabric, the yellowy ochre fabric, and the green for the grass that goes at the bottom. So we're going to start with F1, which is the yellowy coloured fabric. So we'll just move the others out of the way. And then we're going to cut a piece the size of the door. So I'm just going to lay mine on the fabric so as I can get a rough idea as to where my 1/4 inch seam allowance will need to be for cutting. So I can move that down a little bit. Okay, So I shall just put a cut in there. And I'll just cut that piece. I'm going to cut all the way up to the top because it's a little bit easier. Then I can see where I need to go with it. So let's move that round a bit. Make sure I've got plenty to cover. And I'm going to put a little bit of glue, just flip it over first, put a bit of glue in the centre where the door is. And then I'm going to lay that over the top. And then we can just check on the other side to see if you look in the light. And it's quite difficult to do this bit on camera, just to make sure that you have covered the door and you have got a 1/4 inch seam allowance either side of these lines here, which are going to be the stitching lines. So that's F1. So we're now going to do F2, which is the terracotta. Just looking for my bit of plastic, which I seem to have left near the sewing machine. So we'll just place that quite close but not on the line, and flip that piece over and just press it down. And I'm going to trim the fabric underneath by 1/4 inch. And then this is the fabric we're using for the frame. So the width of the piece I've got is not wide enough, but that's fine. I'm just going to trim the selvage bit off because I don't want to get that in the way of my piecing. So I can see, if I use these bits as a guide as well, that I'm just going to trim my piece to there. The other side is a similar length, so I think probably half of this piece will be okay. So, because it's a very narrow frame. Okay, so flip that back over, place your piece of fabric right sides together, and we're going to have a look and see if it'll fit the way we've done before. So I've put it where I think it needs to be. I'm going to flip that piece over, grab the 2 pieces of fabric underneath with the paper. You can see that's just slipped slightly. And then place it printed side down. Flip your paper and fabric over to where the stitching line is, and then you can just check underneath to see if you're going to have that piece covered. And I have got probably not enough this side for the seam allowance, but plenty that side, so I'm going to just move it slightly over. This is always a good way of checking. Fold it back. Find where that line is. That looks like it should be okay. And then the line here. Yeah. So I'm now ready to transfer this over to my sewing machine and stitch along this solid line that is between F1 and F2. Again, I have stitched up to the line of F6 and down to the line of F8. So I haven't gone over those lines, I've stitched in between like we've done before. So we'll just flip that over and press that open. Just use your fingers first of all to get that straight at the end of the stitching as much as you can. Just give that a bit of a press. So we're now going to do F3. So let's find my plastic, there it is. So we'll pop that onto just below that line. Flip that piece of paper over. Trim those fabrics to 1/4 of an inch. And so we're looking for the teal coloured with the spots on, because that's part of the actual house. So here's my piece of fabric here. So again, I'm just going to eyeball that for size, including 1/4 inch seam allowance. Actually, I'm just going to cut that off straight up there. And then the strip I'm going to need, again, 1/4 of an inch either side. So I should go to approximately there. So that should be ample to cover that piece. So I shall stitch that piece on next. I've pressed the teal piece over to the left hand side, but as this is such a tiny piece underneath, I am just going to trim the seam allowance down a little bit to make it less bulky. So I'm just going to do it with my scissors, hopefully not cutting into the paper. So we'll just trim that down to about 1/8 of an inch. There we go. Just give that another press with the roller. Make sure it's in the right place. So that was F3. So F4 is another piece of the terracotta. So again, placing your plastic on the line that goes from F1 to F4. Trim to 1/4 of an inch. And again, well, we're using the terracotta this time. I've got a little piece here and I'm just going to have a look and see. Yes, that should be big enough actually, because it covers the 1/4 inch seam allowance either side, and it's plenty wide enough to cover that piece F4. So all your small scraps, you definitely want to keep them. I mean, if they're really, really tiny, they're not going to be any use, but it's surprising how many of these very small pieces you do get to use in foundation paper piecing, which is why as I say, I have said before, it can be wasteful, but if you do keep these small pieces, then it's nowhere near as wasteful as you might think it is. Okay, so that's on the back of there. So I'm now going to stitch along this line just here. So there's F4. We're now going to do F5. And I just found a piece of the teal coloured fabric on the counter here, so that I'd already cut obviously for something else. So I'm going to use that piece, but I am going to cut the bit off at the bottom that I don't actually need, otherwise it could be a bit of a waste. So I'll just find my scissors and just trim that piece off, because that piece might come in use somewhere else in the pattern. Okay, so I think that's in the right place. Yeah, so I'll go and stitch the next piece on. That's my piece F5 stitched on, and I've cut the seam allowance down to approximately 1/8 of an inch underneath on that piece as well. So that was F5. So we're now going to move on to F6, which is the terracotta piece again that runs along the top, and then F7. So I'm going to do those two pieces next off camera, and then we'll come back and look at F8 and F9. So I've sewn on F6 and F7. So that's what it looks like on the other side. We've now got the piece F8, which is the step that leads up to the front door, and that is the piece that I will be using for that. And then F9 is the grass, so I've got a piece of green fabric. Okay, so grab my plastic, place that on the line between F1 and F3, F2, F4, F5, and just fold that over. And I'm just going to lift this piece up a bit because it's got a couple of stitches which are just on the edge there, so I'm just going to ease the fabric back so I can get a better crease along that line, because we want to try and make it as even as possible. We will trim the excess fabric off. And then the piece of terracotta will go right sides together underneath. And I think my piece is quite tight actually, so I'm going to do the little trick, folding that over, folding that back. Let's just move that up a bit. I think it might be a little bit narrow, but we will see. Fold that back to the line that I'm going to be stitching on. And this is the cutting line after we've finished, so that's where we need to make sure that the fabric is covering, and I think it is just about going to do it. So that's going to be another quite tight piece. If you don't want to keep it as tight as that, just, you know, just cut the piece of fabric a little bit bigger. I like to just try it. I'm going to pop a pin in there just to stop it from moving, and then I'll go over to the sewing machine and stitch that on and hope for the best. Okay, so here's the moment of truth. Just remove the pin. And just flip that over. I think it might be okay because I can see it's right up to the edge of the paper. So yeah, that's absolutely fine. So then we're going to do F9, which is the green for the grass. this piece is plenty wide enough. So I'll be back shortly. There we have the door finished. I've trimmed all the loose bits of sewing thread from the back, and we're now going to trim all the little bits of paper off that we don't actually need. And there we go. The last piece to do is G1. So I've got my template and my fabric. So like we've done before, we'll just turn that over. Put some glue on it to stop it from moving. Place your fabric on the top. And then using the correct rotary cutter this time, we'll just trim the edges off. Before you stitch all your pieces together to form your little block, you'll need to take all the paper from the back of each of the patches that you've stitched. So because you've done such a small stitch, you should be able to tear most of it away quite easily. Some parts where they are very small, you'll need to use your tweezers, which is why I've got mine here. But most of it should tear away quite easily. So I'll just get the main part out of the way. And then that piece in the middle is probably going to need the tweezers to remove it. But if you just sort of pull it a little bit to start it off, then well, you can either carry on with the tweezers or just use your fingers just to tear it away. And any pieces that are caught either in the corners or in the stitching, you just use your tweezers to pull that out as well. See, I've got a bit of paper stuck in that corner I hadn't noticed, so I'll just pull that piece out. And there we go. All done. We're now ready to stitch the pieces together for Wonky House number 1. So you have got the sky, which is A. You've got the roof, which is B, and the other piece of sky, which is C. So we'll be stitching A to B first. So pop your pieces right side together. You can either use some clips or some pins. I'm going to use pins this time. I do use clips a lot, but these pieces are quite small really. So I should just pop a pin in there. And then the other end, you've got the pieces where you cut on the diagonal just there, and that piece will sit in the corner and against this diagonal piece of fabric there. So I will pop a pin in that end as well. So we're going to stitch a scant 1/4 inch along there, and then press it open. I'm going to press my seam to one side, and then that piece will be stitched on to the end. Just a reminder before you start assembling your block, press all of your pieces before stitching, which I hadn't done unfortunately. So when I made up this one here, I just gave it a quick press after I'd finished stitching it together. Everything else I've now pressed. So we've got the 2 windows stitched together, and then we're going to add this piece of grass on the bottom, and then the door will go to the right hand side. There we have the windows and the door all assembled together. Now where the step meets the grass, I have butted the two pieces together. Hopefully you're going to be able to see this. So one seam is pressed to one side and one seam is pressed to the other side, and you butt those two seams together, and then you should get, once you've stitched, you should get a perfect alignment just there. Hopefully you can see that. So that's the two windows and door. So we're now going to stitch the roof onto the main part of the house to complete this little block. And there we have our Wonky house number 1 completed. The next little block we're going to do are the set of 2 leaves. I decided that I'd like to see how it looked with the 2 different green fabrics that we're using within this project. So I've used the leaves and I've used the green bumbleberries. So I'm going to do my second set of leaves in the same colourway. So I'm going to start with A and B. And then the fabrics that I'm going to use are the cloud one, the brown for the veins of the leaf, and then the 2 green fabrics for the actual body of the leaf. Now I have got quite a number of small pieces that I've managed to gather as we've been stitching the other blocks for this project. So I'm hoping, because a lot of these pieces are quite small, that I'll be able to use some of these for this set of leaves. So I have got template A, and we're going to be sticking on the back of here the green leaf fabric to start us off stitching for this side of the leaf. So I'll just turn that over, pop a bit of glue in A1, and then pop my fabric over the top, making sure that we've got seam allowances covered. And then flip that over, and then we're going to press on the dark line between A1 and A2, so as we can pop the other fabric underneath for stitching. And I'm going to cut a 1/4 inch seam allowance from this green fabric first of all. So there we have our first piece on. Now the next piece is going to be the brown for A2. So I've got my brown fabric. Now it's not a massive area, but we do need to make sure that we are covering the seam allowance on this side, and we need to have a 1/4 inch seam allowance coming from the other side, and it's on quite an awkward angle because it's on the diagonal. So we will need to be a bit careful as to how we're going to cut the piece. I would suggest cutting it as perhaps an oblong and seeing how that goes. So I'm going to lay my piece flat like that, so I can see this side is covered all the way across the seam allowance and the extra bit as well. And I've allowed a good piece of seam allowance above, so I will need to cut about there and about there for this very small piece. Okay. So we'll just fold that back, pop that piece right sides together with the green leaf. Now I can see through this paper that it has covered it, but if you want to be extra sure, again like we have done before, if you open up your paper, fold it the opposite way on that line, then you'll be able to see whether that piece is covered or not, and I can see that it's covered very well by those two pieces of fabric that's sticking out on the corners. So I'm ready to sew that piece down. I'm going to also stitch A3 and A4, and then we'll come back and have a look at how far we've got. Okay, so I have stitched on A1, A2, A3 and A4. So we're now ready to stitch A5, and I'm going to be using the green bumbleberries for the bottom two parts of the leaf. So just place the plastic just below the line which joins A4 to A5. Trim the 1/4 inch. And then I have a piece of green here which I'm hoping is going to be big enough. I think it will be. I'll just pop that in place. Now it's not having to cover a seam allowance on the right hand side, it's just on the left hand side. So I think that will be okay. So I will go ahead and stitch that piece on, and then I'm going to stitch A6 and A7, and we'll come back and look at A8. So I've stitched all my pieces on for the main part of the leaf down to A7. So we're now going to look at doing A8. A8 is part of the sky, and as you can see it's quite a tiny piece. If you can, when you're stitching this piece A6 on, if you can end your stitching on this black line of A8, that would be really useful. The reason being is if we just flip that over, and if I fold that back, if you've actually stitched into this section, you might find that when you fold it back, the paper might tear because it is such a very small piece. So it is quite useful to be able to do that. If you haven't done that and you've stitched into it, then that is not a problem. What I would suggest you do is before you fold the paper over, I would just gently pull your fabric away from the stitches so you have got a bit more room to maneuver with this small piece. So I have already trimmed my pieces of fabric here to 1/4 inch. So we're now ready to put the fabric in for A8. So I have got a piece of fabric here, and I know it's going to be big enough because it's absolutely huge compared to the little area that I'm covering. But I do obviously want to make sure that it has it is either in the middle or at least got enough seam allowance on the left and the right hand side, which that has. So I'm going to very carefully stitch that piece on, and again, because this line is adjoining another piece here because it's in the middle, I'm going to attempt to stop at these two lines here. Hopefully you can see that little line that I have stitched. On this bottom end it did just go over slightly, but that's okay. And I've back stitched at the beginning and at the end. So now we're ready to move on to piece A9. So we want another piece of the sky fabric. So I've got a piece here which I'm going to see if that's going to work. So as that's already got an angle on it, I am going to see, I don't think that's not going to work, no, because it needs to be able to cover the two seam allowances, because it's got seam allowance on both sides of it, so that piece isn't big enough. So I do have a really big piece here, so I'll give that piece a try. I think that piece will be absolutely fine. We can always trim the excess off, and then you can use the smaller pieces in other parts of your project. So I am going to move it over slightly. You can see where the seam allowance is, or sort of ends, just so as I can make sure that I'm not using a great big piece of fabric right in the middle. So that should be okay. So I shall go and stitch along that line, and I'll also do a 10, and then that'll be this half of the leaf finished. There is side A finished, so I'll just flip that over so you can have a look. I am now going to do B and C, and then when I finish those two, we'll come back and we'll do D. Okay, so I've got leaf number 1 stitched together and pressed with the iron. I've done the C part of the second leaf, so we're now going to concentrate on the D part. So again, turn your piece over, and we're starting with the leaf fabric. And hopefully that piece will fit. We'll just get the leaves around the right way. Yeah, that should be okay. So a little bit of glue, and stick that one over the top, covering the seam allowances as well. So with your postcard or piece of plastic, whatever it is that you're using, just to help press a crease, we're going to do D2. Pull that over, just press it down, and then cut a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And the next piece, D2, is in the brown. So we'll cut a piece of brown fabric. Place that behind the green leaf. Just make sure if there's any seam allowance that needs to be covered, which there is on this side, you've allowed enough for that. So now I'm going to go over to the sewing machine and stitch on this line that's between D1 and D2. So we'll now flip the piece of brown over. Just make sure that you've got it close to the stitching. Just do a bit of finger pressing. Use your roller if you want to, just to make it a bit more flat. And you can hopefully see that I've stitched a little bit over the line from this line on D2 into the seam allowance that runs around the outside of this little unit, and I've stopped at the solid line that leads into D7. So now we're going to stitch D3 onto D2. So we need a piece of the leaf fabric. Have I got a piece to hand is the question. Oh, there it is. These fabrics do hide from me. So we want the leaves to go that way round, and we're going to be covering this piece here. So if we do it on the back like that, that could go up there. We've got 1/4 inch that side, we've got plenty that side. So we will cut I'm going to cut a square up here and along this bit here. So we'll just check which way we want the leaves, if we can get it to go. Although obviously leaves on trees are at all funny angles anyway, so it doesn't really matter. So we will pop it on that way round, so at least the leaves will be facing upwards. So for this piece, I'm just going to check to make sure that the piece I've cut is going to be big enough. So fold the paper over, flip it over, keeping the fabrics together, pull the paper up to the line that you're going to be stitching, and then just have a check to make sure that this piece of fabric is sitting within the reverse side of the fabric that you want to stitch it onto, which that piece is. Okay, so we're next going to stitch along this line between D2 and D3. Okay, so I've stitched on fabric pieces D1 to D5, so we've just got D8 and D9 left to do on this little piece. So finding my piece of elusive plastic again, there it is. So we'll just pop that on there and pull back D8. Now I know some of the stitches are over the line there, so I shall just pick it all up and just pull the fabric away from the stitches slightly. And just, oh, off skew there, so just repress that piece of paper down. And then I'll cut my 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then we want a piece for the sky. So I'll just have a look and see if I've got any small-ish scraps, which there's a piece there. Let's see if that would be big enough. So it should be in theory, but it depends. Let's put it round that way so we can test it again. So this piece will need to have both seam allowances allowing each side. So we'll just pop that like that and flip that piece over. Find where the seam allowance is, and yes, that will fit. Okay, so I'm going to use that piece for D8, and there we have it ready to trim the paper from the back of it. There is the leaf finish. We just need to give it a bit of a press. But before I put the iron on it, I'm just going to press the seam on the back open. I think for the leaf, because it is so bulky with all those little bits that you've sewn together, I think rather than pressing the seam to one side, I think it would be better just to press it open. It'll just make it sit flatter. So we'll just do that. And just flip it over. And then I'm going to put the iron on and give it a press. And then this is the bottom leaf out of the two. So I will then be stitching the two together using a scant 1/4 inch. Once you have all of your houses and your trees and leaves assembled, then it's time to decide how you want to put them together if you're going to be making the bag that I've supplied instructions for as well. So this is the layout that I have used. So I've got one house in the middle, a set of leaves either side, another house, and then trees on the end. So to be able to make the bag, the bucket bag, I have attached a piece of fabric to the top of this, so it's quite a tallish bag, and I've also put some foam underneath and then the lining fabric underneath that one. So that's the three things you're going to need for the body of the bag. I've also hand tacked the three pieces together. So when I get them under the machine, hopefully it won't move. So I'll just pull that over a bit so as you can see all of it together. So that's ready, and I'll talk to you about how I'm going to quilt that in a moment. When you purchase the pattern, you get a pattern piece for the base of the bag and for the lining. So the pattern piece is used for the main fabric and for the lining, and it's also used for the foam if that's what you're putting inside. That's what I would recommend to use because it will make the bag more sturdy and not so floppy. So you will get 2 halves of the circle. So you need to tape them together first of all. So where you've got the number 1 and the pink lines, what you need to do is you need to pop one pink line on top of the other. In fact, actually what you could do first of all is trim one of the edges up to the pink line and then pop it on top of the other one, and you will also then have the 2 number 1s will form a full circle. And then what I do is I tape the 2 pieces together all the way down and then just cut the circle out with some paper scissors by hand. If you're printing the pattern out from a PDF, then you have got a 1 inch test square on here as well. So when you do print the first page, I would measure that test square just to make sure it does measure 1 inch before you carry on and print the next piece. Okay, so that is the pattern for the base. I have already quilted the base of mine. So what I've done is I've cut out a square of the foam, the lining and the main fabric I'm using for the outside of the bag. and I've quilted it using a stitch length, I think it was about 3.5, and each section is about 1/2 inch in between each one, so it just makes it quite a nice, actually if you run your hand along it feels lovely, but it just makes it quite a nice dense bit of quilting. So that's it on what will be the lining part. Now I used a clear filament thread for the top. The reason I've used that is I'm going to do the same type of quilting on the main piece of the bag where all of the FPP designs are, and I didn't really want anything to distract too much from the houses and the trees. So I'm going to use this, well, it's nylon thread actually. It's very, very fine, but I'm going to use that that's going to be on the top of the piece, and I'm using cream in the bobbin because this fabric underneath has got a cream background. So that's how I did this part of the base. So what I'm going to do now with the base is I'm going to stick my two half circles together and cut it out, and then that will be for the base of here. So I'm just going to draw around it, and then I'll be ready to quilt the main part of the bag. Here is my completed foundation paper piece panel. So I have used a clear nylon thread for the top of the panel, and on the back in the bobbin I have used a cream quilting thread, that thread for the machine. So I have quilted mine at 1/2 inch width going across the diagonal, so that makes it then quite sturdy for when we put it together and make it into a tube. It should stand up quite nicely once the bag is put together. And there is the base for my bag, which has also been quilted every 1/2 inch, again with the clear thread, which is this side is going to be the outside, and then the cream for the lining. So I'm now going to stitch the two ends of the panel together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then I'm going to attach the base, but I'm going to stitch this on with an 1/8 inch seam allowance, because then we're going to be putting binding around the bottom of the base and around the top of the bag. Here is the bag assembled. So we've got the base stitched onto the main panel. I've just stitched that on with an 1/8 inch seam allowance at the moment, because we will be stitching binding onto it. On the inside I've also put a piece of straight cut binding to cover the seam that's joining the panel together. So we're now ready to look at the binding. We'll be making bias binding for this bag. As it's a circle, we need it to stretch around the seams to enclose them. So what you're going to start off with first of all is a square of fabric, and then cut it in half across the diagonal. And then, as you can see here, you place one piece on top of each other, so right sides together. So you've got your two triangles, right sides together, and then you sew a 1/4 inch seam to join the two pieces together. So I've already done that, and I've also pressed the seam open. So what you're going to have is a sort of skew width diamond shape. There are two methods of cutting your fabric for the bias binding. You can either draw the lines on the reverse of the fabric, And then what you would do is you would bring one corner into the middle there and another corner into the opposite middle corner. But when you've got your lines on here, what you would need to do is you would need to actually pull them so as this would be slightly skew width to get the lines running straight. Then you would sew along this seam and then just cut with scissors round and round and round, and then you would get continuous binding. I'm not so over keen on that method. I do find the binding ends up not being very accurate width all the way through. So I'm not going to do mine that way. I'm going to do mine just with a ruler and the rotary cutter, and I'm just going to cut the strips that I need. So the strips for this particular bag I'm going to cut at 2 1/4 inches. I went ahead and sewed my binding pieces together to make one long strip, and then I folded it in half and I pressed it. So the first part I'm going to do is the top of the bag. So I've pinned it on and I'm going to stitch it on with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I've left some little tails here for the finishing off. I've stitched the binding onto the top of the bag and I've folded it over to the inside and I've clipped it all around ready for stitching. I'm going to do a stitch in the ditch, which is where you just stitch under this fold of the binding itself, and then that will stitch through to the back and secure the binding to the lining of the bag. This is a quick tutorial to show you how to make a bag strap. So the fabric for your strap, you need to cut it 4 inches wide and the length that you want it finished. Also include to that length 1 inch for your turnings. So this is my fabric here. You then need to either put fusible interfacing on, or as I've done, fusible fleece. So with the fleece you need to keep it out of the seam allowances, so cut your length of fleece 1 inch shorter than the fabric. You'll then need to fold it over in half and press, open it out, fold one side into the middle and press, and fold the opposite side into the middle and press. I like to then just fold it all together and just give it another press on both sides. So you then will need to pop your piece of seam allowance over, and I'm just going to do the one side, fold in to the middle, just going to put a clip on there I think. So fold into the middle, fold the other side into the middle, and then fold the two pieces together. Just pop that clip there, and then either put pins in or clip all the way around the edge here, and then you're ready to sew. And I sew mine all the way around the outside using 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, and that will be your strap. So once you've done your strap, you need to sew it onto your bag. So there's mine sewn onto the bag. So I've sewn mine on the outside, and it's just about 1 inch down from the top of the bag.